Hi, my name is Tanya Khokar. I'm a senior policy expert with ICRW. I've been with the organization for almost a year, working on the Generation Equality Forum process. I live in New York City, but I'm originally from Pakistan, which has, I think, really shaped my feminism. I grew up at a time with a military dictatorship, with the Sharia law, where a lot of rights were limited for women and girls, especially minorities, especially rural women, low-income women. And so I think that really defined my feminism in a way. I came to the US for college, and I have stayed here since then, working on women's rights, on ending violence against women, on ending child marriage, economic justice, a range of issues. And I've also worked in philanthropy, in community-based organizations, at the UN, and now at ICRW, which is a research-based organization. The feminism for me is really, I think, is really about centering people in agenda setting, in decision making, getting women and girls and all their diversity to engage. And I think it goes a little bit beyond engaging. It's really about who holds power, but how you shape the power, what you do with the power, and how we alter systems of oppression with the power that you have. Feminism, again, is centering people, women and girls, in all decision making. And that's when you really make systemic change happen.
My name is Leanne Sajor. I use she, her pronouns. And I guess I should introduce myself. I identify as a migrant young feminist. I'm originally from the Philippines, but I moved to occupied Bansi-Lenape land, which is also known as Queens, New York, around high school. And I was a formerly undocumented person, so that shaped a lot of my experience of the world, especially after I moved to the United States. Yeah, I would describe my feminism as trans-inclusive, intersectional, and internationalist. My current paid work is I'm a senior advisor at Tides Advocacy, which is an organization that supports different movements across the United States that are pushing for a progressive and a pro-Black liberation agenda. And I also serve as an advisor for Frida Young Feminist Fund. And so, I've worked for the past 12 years around decolonizing development and economic justice and feminist economics in different roles and varying degrees of advocacy, from like local to national, regional, particularly in the Asia Pacific, but then also, kind of weaving together solidarities between international movements. And a lot of that work was centered around the UN processes. But I think more and more, the attention of this type of work for me is more interesting in a much more local level. I have a very different relationship to the 1995 Beijing conference. So the significance of it came to me in a very personal way. My mother is a feminist activist in the Philippines, coming from a generation of student leaders and liberation fighters who were struggling against the Marcos dictatorship. And so the ideas around rights and justice and feminism and women's role in the struggle is like really present in my family. And because both of my parents were activists. And so my mother was in 1995, was working with an organization called the Asian Women's Human Rights Council, AWHRC. And that is a regional feminist organization that led the preparatory meetings for the Asian women's movements in the lead up to the 1995 conference in Beijing. And so as a child, I would just be around all these, feminist, severely powerful, seemingly tireless women from the Philippines who are talking about all these issues. And I'm just kind of the young person around them who has to do their homework. And, and it's just kind of like a very personal way of getting introduced to these things. And then I should say my mother's name is Inday Sajor. And so she was the lead organizer for this. By the time that kind of like the formal intergovernmental meeting for Asia happened in Jakarta, my mom has been organizing with all these feminist leaders all over Asia Pacific. And they had a delegation of 30 women. After I moved to New York, my mother was then invited to be part of the Asia Pacific Intergovernmental for Beijing Plus 15. And so she brought me to it knowing that I have someone, I have a little bit of personal history into this. And she just kind of wanted me to understand the civil society space. In 2013, I then had the opportunity to co-organize the Asia Pacific Civil Society Forum for Beijing Plus 20. I was working a lot with young feminists in the region, and that was a really, really inspiring part of my work.
Lian, what a beautiful experience. I'm envious. Your mom sounds amazing, and I can't imagine what fun it was even for the feminists to have a young person like you with them. I think it probably made it more energetic for everybody. So it's pretty cool that you were part of those conversations. My experience was very different. As you know, Pakistan it borders China, but I was in middle school at the time of Beijing. I don't remember hearing anything, even in my family, growing up with all women, with a female prime minister. There was very little that was shared about the conference. And I know there's a few civil society organizations were present. There were government representatives that went to the conference, but I think in the media, I think just culturally around me, there was very little that connected us at that moment in time to what was happening in a country right next to us, which was really vibrant with a lot of other organizations. But for me, what's interesting is the last 2 years, especially being part of the Generation Equality Forum process, is when I've heard a range of experiences, right, from different activists, from the leaders who were at the conference, which has been beautiful to hear, like such rich stories from how different grassroots organizations were present, how it gave people pretty much for the first time a space to be visible, to share their concerns, to share their challenges, to come together and mobilize and take what they had learned and built at the conference back to their national contexts, right? And also have these accountability mechanisms where the 5-year reviews for Beijing have really built the momentum and have really encouraged organizations to stay engaged and let their governments know that, hey, we signed this Platform for Action, which is probably one of the most progressive documents still today for women on women's rights, on gender equality. What are you doing in your national context to make sure that we are implementing those pieces, right? And those 12 actions are I think they're pretty transformative. They inspire me till today. They inspire the movement. And that's what GEF, the Generation Equality Forum, I feel is really building on.
I can't say that I will speak to how young feminists relate to this history today. I hope that it's still alive and that it resonates in a deeply personal way, because I think that is part of our history. But I also recognize how it's been kind of like a professionalized history and a very professionalized kind of, way of understanding this. But there's also so much kind of personal care and relationships that was built throughout the Beijing process. And I think that we can draw a lot of inspiration and power from that.
What I've seen is something similar as well, in the sense that the advisory group has done a good job of engaging young people in different conversations. The Beijing Task Force is there. They're engaged in the different action coalitions, but something is missing. I can't find the right word for it. I think it's genuine, authentic youth leadership is not there. And I also think that youth from my part of the world, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, I feel that there's not as much engagement. People back home, when you talk to them, I've tried to engage organizations around this process, and they don't know much about Beijing. They don't talk about GEF, and they don't know how to engage, right? Like, I think there's a disconnect between UN headquarters, there's a disconnect between groups on the ground and their government. Government processes have happened, regional consultations have happened, and those have been interesting because I think those have given an opportunity for young people to engage, and from my region. But till today, I think certain voices are missing. Clearly, capitalism has set up a system which doesn't support everyone, right? It's not inclusive. Profits are going in a few hands. And just starting with COVID, we've seen how it's impacted women and girls. It's magnified challenges within the economic, within the political, within the social and health sectors. There's impact on livelihood. Women have dropped out of the labor force. Sectors that women have worked in have been impacted: agriculture, restaurant, apparel, tourism, and of course, care work. The impact on care work is immense, where globally there's increase in domestic chores, homeschooling. Even pre-COVID, there was a lot of work on care workers. But today, as we know, care is not part of the economic structure of the developing countries, whether it's schools, whether it's health systems. And when we see the social protection programs that have been implemented by governments, they are not gendered. According to a UNDP tracker, across Africa, 189 different measures were taken post-COVID to recover as a response plan. And out of those 189, just 16% were gender sensitive. And many of them are not even looking at domestic work or unpaid care work. So the impact of COVID has really elevated the fact that social protections are not enough for women and girls. Besides COVID, I think what's really essential and what is missing from this current model is feminist leadership and inclusion, where we see that women are not participating in budget decisions, they're not participating in economic plans. Women's political inclusion just in itself is less than 25% in parliaments around the world. And we know that domestic politics influences economic decisions, right? So when you think about it, it's impossible to prioritize women's agenda unless women are in leadership positions. So to wrap up that point, our issues, our very important issues get sidelined if we're not front and center, and it has to be, of course, all women representation, right? Diverse women, indigenous women, migrant women, queer, trans, women with disabilities, everyone has to be front and center to be making those economic decisions. Thirdly, I think when we talk about the current system, we also need to talk about macroeconomic trends and systems which are not working for women, right? It's really about who controls the money and how it's spent. Fiscal policies, gender responsive budgeting, taxation, trade. If you look at all these different macroeconomic trends, they're not sustainable, and they're not including the priorities of different minorities, different groups of people, of women and girls, in all their diversity. So unless we hold institutions accountable for challenging the way they are structured and challenging their practices, which are only benefiting a few, we will not be able to move to a sustainable model of economic growth. Looking at just a quick example, looking at the garment sector, right, in my part of the world, in South Asia, you're seeing a lot of multinational corporations going in there, profiting at the expense of the environment, at the expense of the workers, at the expense of local companies. And so these big MNCs are really exploiting women, I think, in multiple forms, and also really damaging the environment. And unless we're really challenging those practices, it's going to be pretty hard for everybody to be included. And finally, I think this is an important point, is around narratives. Centering the power of language and politics is key. Feminist analysis always does that, right? It centers the analysis on power. So we need to move away from individual economic models of growth and development, which the current system is about, and really reforming systems so we can decolonize the economic justice narrative to question whose policies, whose narratives, whose voices have been included.
That was really great, Tanya. That resonated with me deeply. And I appreciated you kind of bringing in how impactful the COVID global pandemic has been on the lives of people, on the economy, and it just kind of putting such a strong point on how COVID exposed a lot of the inequalities and injustices that already exist and further deepened them. The fundamental question for me is to really understand how the growth and dominant neoliberal development model is designed to extract, exploit, and marginalize women. And I think particularly, just to name it, when we're talking about women and gender oppressed groups of people, I want to kind of name rural, indigenous, migrant, urban poor and working class people, right? Because it's not an even playing field. We know that. And I think sometimes when we talk about women in general, there is a flattening effect that happens. And I think it's important to kind of name those things. I am interested on the macroeconomic stuff. I think, when we better understand the key pillars of the dominant neoliberal economic system and development models, like what we really see is deregulation, privatization, and liberalization, right? And deregulation basically means we take away rules that are there to protect prices. And an example of this is like people should be able to access staples like rice and vegetables, and there are rules in place so to make sure that those remain affordable and accessible to people. But what we have seen over the years is that prices of rice, for example, is extremely expensive. And privatization is about things that are public services, like healthcare, for example, is now controlled by corporations. And we see this even the vaccine rollout currently, right? And how kind of vaccine nationalism, the privatization of healthcare is so difficult, is really putting people in so much harm and suffering. And liberalization as the third pillar is that just we're reducing the barriers of the flow of goods between countries, which is really important to protect even our farmers, for example. Like, this is huge. In the Philippines, we buy rice. We're a rice producing country, but we buy rice from neighboring Southeast Asian countries. What is going on there? And their farmers are suffering, right? And when we think about that, we know that women carry the brunt of that difficulty. They're giant, big concepts that I think when we feel it are deeply personal in our experience of the world. And, we just continue to see that, women's access to essential services are decreasing, where they're deprived of their land and their natural resources and, access to livelihoods that, allow them to live in dignity. That's a deeply personal experience of the economy. And so when we think about economic justice, it's not just these international financial institutions, although they play such an important role, but really the impact of those decisions are, kind of in the minutia of our day to day.
I mean, just looking at our countries, right? Looking at Pakistan, looking at Philippines, I think the average person does not know much about the economy. Day to day, of course, they're impacted because of income, because of inflation, because of buying rice, as you said, because of the mundane things that make our economic lives work. But at the end of the day, big macro trends like taxation, like debt, like these IFI policies that are devastating the lives of our people, that devastating the systems that we work in. Even politicians in my country, female politicians, they have not been trained on how to work on taxes, how to reform taxes to make them more gendered, what taxation policies, what budget policies are needed to make sure that COVID recovery plans are more gender inclusive. We need to train young people, of course, with a language and narrative that they understand. But a lot of our politicians, our female politicians that are in the government, I think they also need to be trained to understand different economic systems, how they work, how budget decisions are made, and retrain them so they are confident enough to participate in those decisions. Looking at the history of colonization and how it's developed these systems where private companies are extracting and they're making profits at the expense of the community, right? And there's absolutely no accountability for many of these corporations. So if you look at the garment sector and what's happening in South Asia, a lot of these multinational corporations, big companies are coming in, and they are not abiding by the same rule and standard that local companies are, because most of the products are being exported. And so women that are working in these factories are vulnerable because they are being paid $2 or $3 a month. They are working under very difficult conditions. They are sometimes working overtime without being paid. And so what we're seeing is that the standards that apply locally, despite countries signing international conventions, they're not applicable to foreign companies because there's no accountability. For a lot of these companies, accountability is something from the outside, and accountability, I think, really needs to build in and needs to be front and center before any contract is signed, before any agreements move forward. I think one of the difficulties with accountability and holding private sector accountable is also lack of data. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough metrics and standards to hold these companies to account. Besides the data existing on the other side, I think it's very hard for local communities, for women to actually report. And companies are making it harder for women to actually come out and report against violence or harassment or any other kinds of those practices that are happening. In terms of opportunity, I think let's talk about the Generation Equality Forum. There are a few private companies that have engaged from the start, philanthropy as well as private corporations that have come in early on, that are part of the action coalitions, that are setting priorities. But what they're also doing early on is that they are building those indicators, those targets, those metrics to make sure that these companies will abide by the commitments, and they will have practices and policies that align with the commitments that are in the blueprints, right, that are in the action coalitions. I think innovative partnerships such as the Equality Fund, which is another example, which is a donor collaborative between governments, between philanthropy, and between impact investors. I think those kind of models can be really interesting because, again, they also are not only setting up those metrics early on, but they're accountable to the movement. They're accountable to the women's rights organizations, to the women's rights funds, to the grassroots organizations that are constantly questioning and challenging and front and center to tell these companies that your practices are not correct. Here's how you need to change. So I think having, this is something that Leanne had mentioned earlier as well, having the women's rights movement presence, women's funds, feminist organizations in these decision-making models to make sure that not just private sector, but governments are also accountable. Governments are also challenging the practices that private companies have.
I just want to say one other thing about this in terms of opportunities, because Tanya already talked about governments, and that is, that is incredibly important. But I think one other thing too that I just want to name is that the importance of solidarities between organizations and movements between countries is incredibly important in holding the private sector accountable. When I was working with the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, which is a regional feminist organization, I was learning about the work of Asia Floor Wage, for example, right? And, and this particular campaign was trying to build a regional minimum wage. And so they are working with women workers, many of whom are garment workers in different parts of Asia, so that we're not trapped in this race to the bottom, policy situation with our governments, where the corporations are just jumping from one place to another and pinning us against each other. So building those solidarities is really, really important. It's hard work, and it also requires so much of our time and resources. But I think it's an important element to when we talk about opportunities and how to hold for the private sector accountable.
I think we need to engage the average citizen as well to let them know that they can also question the private sector. They can question these big multinational companies. When you're going to buy your t-shirt at an H&M, or when you're going to buy your pants at another store, we need to ask, where are you buying? What's your supply chain model? How much are you paying your garment workers? How many taxes are you paying, right? So I think the average citizen also has the duty to change their practices, their buying practices, if companies are not behaving according to certain standards and policies.
When I think about the contributions of feminist movements, I really think about it really intersectionally, and how things that may have been just kind of issues that people felt in the private sphere become something that is much more public, and also the systemic recognition of these problems, right? And these issues that we are experiencing. So, I think about the recognition of unpaid care work, right? And this position about recognition, reduction, or redistribution of unpaid care work, that comes from the feminist movement. I think about, like the rights of domestic workers, right? Like that is an ongoing struggle. And that is, that also an international struggle.
Well, I say it's not easy because it really depends on the context, right? When I go back to my country, you see a lot of hierarchy. That's how the culture is. And you see it's hard to sit down with older feminists and engage and share your ideas, because in a meeting room with different organizers, different feminist leaders, the voice of older generation is always heard, and young people are not as recognized, not as appreciated. Their input is not as valuable compared to spaces in our work in the US, right? So I think depends on context. It really changes. But a few reminders are that we're not starting from scratch, right? There's decades of hard work that has been done by our grandmothers, our own families, our community organizers, our members. There's tons of knowledge, tons of books out there on care work. Right now, care is front and center because of COVID, but since the 70s, since the 80s, a lot of great, excellent analysis has already been done on care, and feminists have been advocating for care work, decent work for decades. So this is not something new. We really need to believe young people as fierce leaders, because they're the ones that are working across sectors. They're the ones that are working across movements in a really powerful way, right? They're organizing online, they're organizing in person, and they have decentralized ways of working, which I think is a really unique skill. And so they have digital skills as well. So there's a whole bucket of tools that young people can provide. And so I think we need to appreciate and recognize the role that young people can play today.
What resonated with me is the fact that we are in this particular position because of the hard work and the legacy of struggles of those who came before us. And I think it is the responsibility of young people to understand that history, and that not just the history that is written on the books, but the history that we find on our kitchen tables, and that may not be part of these processes, but the kind of conversations and relationships that might give light to the struggles and also the wins of the different experiences that we have in each of our contexts, right? And that's not always housed in a particular kind of formal knowledge. I think young people also are in a world that is vastly different. When I talk to like my mother and aunties in the struggle, I really try to understand like what was their analysis at that point and how is it different? And for me, it's incredibly different. There's there are things that are like kind of familiar, but there are pieces of it that are not. And I just kind of want to point this out because we live in a vastly different world. We're incredibly globalized. Like, I think it's just important to recognize that young people stand on their own and are having to deal with new types of challenges and struggles that may not be familiar to people from a different generation. And so the question is, how do you build solidarities between these different generations in a genuine way? I thought about your metaphor, Tanya, about passing the torch, but what does it mean to light my own torch and have a multiplicity of torches that can light the way towards, towards our liberation? Sometimes the kind of light that previous generations held are not the type of light that will lead us in different fights now, right? And so I think I want to kind of think about that a little bit more.
So I'm curious, what do you think? How you think the movement today is more fragmented? Do you think younger people are doing a better job of working in a less fragmented, in a more coordinated way than what I've seen feminist movements to be, or do you think we still need to work on that a little bit more?
When I think about the kind of organizing that was happening amongst feminist movements in 95, where you don't have the same kind of internet and circuits of communication that we do now, you'll see that how strangely they were much more coordinated and organized. And not to say that we're not now, but maybe I'm making generalizations here, but I do think that there is something to be said about the dispersed type of struggles that are emerging now. And I think that that has a lot of power to it too, right? I think we are of a mindset of the kind of movement building where we need to consolidate more in numbers, more in attention, right? Like if we consolidate, we're stronger. And I think when we think about movement tactics and what young people are able to do is that they're redefining the ways of organizing from the very beginning. And so when we think about, our targets of, intergovernmental spaces, multilateral spaces, this is very much was shaped for a particular time in history, right? And so when we think about the ecosystem or the landscape completely changing, the target isn't just the UN anymore. In fact, I sometimes wonder, as someone who's dedicated, several years of their lives working around the SDGs and Beijing, I wonder how much of this is really kind of still resonate and relevant to the experiences of young people today. I'm not sure. I don't know what the answer is to that question, but I just kind of want to recognize that there is a dispersion of struggles. And I think there are more leaderless movements, or maybe I should say like leaderful movements, right? And I think that that is very, very powerful and kind of a different playbook.